much, and I must say thank you to the organizers as well for inviting me to talk here. We've had 4 fantastic and greatly in-depth presentations that have talked about the kind of research we can do around air pollution and health, and also some of the findings around that research. And what I'm going to do is take a slightly different perspective and talk about why we need to do that research. Why it's so important that we actually ask these questions about the links between air pollution and health. And in doing that as well, I must apologize if I'm making an assumption here, but I looked at the people who were attending this workshop and decided not to go into depth in terms of particular studies that I've been involved in, but rather to use some case studies to exemplify what I'm going to talk about, and then really just talk a bit more in terms of theory and a broader approach to things. So in terms of my presentation, I'll talk a little bit about what we think of as environmental injustices, going into a little bit of thinking and talking about social vulnerabilities as they relate to exposure to air pollution and then subsequent impacts on health. I'll maybe go a little bit faster around the theorizing of justice, because that is in itself a huge topic, and then end with just some of the discussion about what's happening right now in terms of acting for environmental justice. So just to start with, when we talk about environmental justice, environmental injustices, we tend to make a distinction between exposure to risks, and I would say that most of the presentations that have happened so far have really focused on that in terms of the exposures to certain types of risks. But then we also talk about it in terms of access to environmental resources. And there are questions around, for example, privatization of energy sources. Access to different types of energy also become important in that conversation. I'm going to go through a couple of examples about what that means in terms of air pollution and environmental justices as we've seen in Africa. And I mean, as we all know, obviously Africa is a continent, it's vastly huge, and there's a whole lot of differentiation in the kind of issues that we see. But as Michael mentioned earlier on, certainly indoor air pollution at the scale of the individual, at the scale of the household, is where we see a great deal of an issue in terms of the health impacts of air pollution. Where it becomes a question of justice is about the lack of energy access that we see in so many places in the world. At a different scale, we see what happens in terms of people in occupational situations being exposed to risk. And for me, one of the important things that I did want to raise with this particular slide is that I think in the introductory presentation, there was a discussion about how we're seeing certain types of pollutants going down in Europe. One of the things that we are seeing in terms of the work that I do is the movement of dirty and polluting industries away from the global north towards the global south. So large garment factories actually moving to Ethiopia, and that movement to the global south is actually a relocation of some of that pollution to the global south. But also when that happens, we also need to make the connections back to who's consuming those products. And it's often what's happening here in the West, the fast fashion that we're all using. So thinking about it in scale of a global economy and the kind of movements that happen there. And then also at the end of life cycles, thinking about injustices in terms of air pollution when we look at, for example, electronic waste dumping that's happening in Ghana. There's some kind of recycling and sorting that happens, but in many cases what I've seen both in India and in Ghana is that there's simply burning of a lot of this e-waste. And so what does that mean in terms of air pollution? But making that connection, I think, is really important, that we understand when we're talking about air pollution, when we're talking about health impacts, we need to think about this in the broader picture of the socio-economic and political drivers that are really leading to the particular conditions where we see environmental pollution, where we see health impacts, and therefore where we also see injustice. So at the beginning, they talked about the DIPSA framework, and Michael also brought up sort of the environmental determinants framework. Was it Gusek that you mentioned? And this is something from the World Health Organization. And really what I just wanted to do by putting this up here was just reminding you that when we think about drivers' pressure state impact response, we also need to think about it in terms of what are the social conditions, what are the economic conditions, what are the political conditions associated with that, not just what are the environmental conditions, what are the heights of buildings, and so forth. So it's thinking about those kind of inequalities in terms of income, education, occupation, migrant status, and so forth as being determinants. But also on the other side of the spectrum, what kind of access do people have to health services? What kind of opportunities do they have to actually secure that access, and so forth. So thinking about broadening out our understanding both of environmental determinants, but also of how we use the DIPSA framework to think about it from a socio-economic perspective. And one term hope that you would take away from this presentation is this notion of intersectionality. It's something that comes from feminist studies, and it's really the idea that we have to think about the intersecting characteristics or conditions of our social relations and how they have an impact on how we are affected by things. So, to take an example, a working class man in Malmö or Copenhagen might be far worse exposed to air pollution and health risks compared to a upper middle class woman in a leafy suburb in Pretoria, South Africa, who is very protected from air pollution. That we can't make generalizations about populations. To some degree, our studies require us to do that when we have the big data. But when we start to think about what are the implications in society in terms of social relations, I would ask that we have to then complicate our work a little bit and think about what it means in terms of class, in terms of gender, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of sexuality and other factors, and how those all connect to each other when we think about it. So intersectionality as a perspective to bring in when we're thinking about who is being exposed, how are they being exposed, what are their possibilities to also then recover from this exposure and potential health impacts associated with it. And maybe just to give you a sense of why intersectionality is important, especially when we're trying to take from big data studies down to individual people. I'm sharing some, and this is a little bit of an old study. It's 2004 from Massey, and it's based in Massachusetts in the US. But I could have just as easily put studies that I've been involved in South Africa recently, and certainly examples such as Flint in the US remind us that some of these factors about ethnicity, class, race, gender are so important. So this is just one of the examples that shows you the cumulative toxics exposure in relative to race in Massachusetts, and you can see that the mean number of sites per square mile increases substantially in those neighborhoods area where 25% or more of the population are people of color, right? So we're seeing here that there is a distribution in terms of toxic or dirty sectors, industries, or waste dumps based on race. We're also seeing that when we look at mortality in terms of race, again in the US and in Massachusetts, substantially higher rates of asthma mortality amongst the black population than the white population in the study. Taking the figures that we have and disaggregating it down, we actually see that it's not a simple case that air pollution affects everyone the same way and that everyone is able to cope with the health impacts the same way. They are substantially different. And that's really where the link between air pollution and environmental justice comes in, where the work that I do comes in. It's trying to understand some of these differences and some of what we would then define as being injustices in the system. So Robert Bullard, considered the grandfather of environmental justice, basically says that environment is everything and that we should not separate the physical environment from the cultural environment. And in the cultural environment, I tie socioeconomic and political environments as well. A lot of the work on environmental justice has come from the notion of eco-racism or environmental racism. And that, like I showed in the slides before, there's a recognition of deeply entrenched patterns of domination that unjustly define people of color, women, the poor, and other groups of humans, as well as the natural world, as inferior and less worthy of life, right? So that we have a situation where there are these inconsistencies in how we view people, how we treat people, how we make policy decisions, maybe something Johanna is going to talk about, that really relate to different groups in societies. And that differentiation is quite important. So in the work that I do and other scholars do in terms of environmental justice, a lot of that is thinking about these questions of exposure, of access. But underneath all of that is this questioning about power, right? None of the studies we do are neutral in terms of power, as much as we would try to. None of the studies we do are necessarily objective, as much as we would like them to be. There is also power in many of these aspects. And it's kind of questions of who has the power to make the decisions that affect the environment, who has access to certain natural resources or lack thereof, something that Michael had raised earlier, whose knowledge counts, because a lot of what we do is based on our scientific knowledge. And how does citizen knowledge, experiences, lived experiences come into our studies as well? Tied to that, whose reality matters in that. So these are the kind of questions that we ask about studies around air in Africa and elsewhere in the world, and to try and somehow nuance the work we do to ensure that actually what we're doing is not leading to greater environmental injustice, but also where we're trying to further justice. How do we make sure the most vulnerable are then the ones that we're working with? I'm always hesitant to try and talk about justice. It is complex. There is a great deal of work that's being done on it. This is a very crude and rough kind of summary of what people sometimes look at when they're talking about environmental justice. And it's not just about distribution of impacts. So distributional justice is certainly the first aspect that we've done the most work on and where historically environmental justice has come in. But also to that, we've added ideas about procedural justice. Who is making the decisions? What information or data is being used to make those decisions? How do we risk taking data from Europe and then modeling and applying that in Africa? Those kind of questions are part of procedural justice. And then the third aspect is recognition justice. The notion that we actually need to recognize and respect different voices, different groups, and particularly those who are often the most invisible in the studies that we do. So we talk a lot about, how successful the Scandinavian and Nordic countries are and how, in general, things are very good. But we also need to recognize that there are substantially different groups in society, and some might be far worse affected, whether it's migrant communities living in ghettoized areas or other groups. Recognition justice asks us to break that down, think about those differences, make sure that we are actually recognizing all groups. So that's sort of just a summary in terms of how some people think about distributional, procedural, and recognition justice. Probably what is quite important for me is that these questions become important for two purposes. One, because there's an intrinsic value to thinking about justice. all of us, I assume, are in the research that we're in because we actually want to make a difference, because we think these are important issues that we should deal with. There's an intrinsic moral sort of guiding principle of why we're doing what we're doing. And that is really important. But there is also an instrumental value to thinking about justice, right? And part of that comes to questions of maybe peace and security in places. How do we ensure that we are being just and fair as a means to ensuring justice, ensuring peace and security in countries in different parts of the world? Another point which I think is why justice is so important is that it is about making inequities visible. There's a lot of work being done now on health equity, and part of that ties into the conversation about environmental justice. I'm a fellow of the Swedish Institute for Global Health Transformations. I am not a medical person. But part of why they've invited me to be there is precisely because we realize that we need to engage with these conversations when talking about global health and global health research. I'm not going to go into too much more of this, but I think you will have access to the slides. But just to make a final point in terms of that is that we have standards and laws in terms of air quality around the world. But we have to recognize that what are the legal limits are not necessarily just, right? So yes, we have certain standards and we might see that people are within those limits. Does that make them acceptable in society? That's a question of justice, not a question of legality. And legality is a matter of power, right? Because it's who gets to set those rules, who gets to define the policy is so important in that question. How we decide on those criteria for justice is also something that is quite complex. And I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail on this. Suffice to say that there are different ways that we define justice. And what we use as our sort of principles of justice also determine what kind of outcomes we're likely to have for that. But at the end of the day, I just wanted to put 2 slides up to talk about that. And one is that we often talk about equality when we're talking about these issues. Equality being giving everyone a box to stand on so that they can watch the baseball game happening there. But actually, what we need to think about is the outcome at the end of the day, right? So what do we want to see as the outcome? Everyone being able to watch that baseball match, which means that someone doesn't get the box and someone else gets 2 boxes to stand on. Those are the kind of issues that we need to think about when we take our studies and our data and think about who is it that we want to affect change with? Who do we want our policy to actually, to benefit the most from our policy? Unfortunately, the reality that we have is substantially different. So where we see cases of saying, let's not take dirty cars to Africa and let's bring in these smart electric cars, we have to also ask that question of who will actually be worse off because of a decision which is better for the environment, but might lead to actually exacerbating current inequalities within a community, within a country. Certainly, if you bring electric cars to South Africa, it will be a very, very narrow group of people who can actually afford that access. And what will it mean for those people who are penalized for using dirty cars when they can't get to work, when they can't actually access so many services? So how do we think about that when it is so complex? It is complex. We're seeing a lot of injustices around the world. Unfortunately, what we're also seeing is that those people who are fighting against injustice are vulnerable to being killed by military, private sector, and other soldiers who are operating to stop those who are trying to criticize what's going on. So this comes from Global Witness, and you can just see the number of environmental activists that are killed worldwide from 2004 to 2014. Obviously, not all of this is about air quality. Air quality is a little bit more difficult. A lot of this tends to be about access to land and other resources. But it's still the notion that I want to leave you with, that people protesting about the injustices that they live with puts their own lives at risk. That makes the research that we do so much more important, because we have the safety to do that research and to tell the stories sometimes that other people are not able to tell. It's a little bit of a bleak situation, and I'm taking the last few minutes that I have to just talk about then how people are acting for environmental justice. One of the big things is about getting information and data out. And so there is something called the Environmental Justice Atlas, which some of you might be aware of, where they're looking at conflicts around the world, whether it's about air pollution, whether it's about huge coal industries and so forth. But mapping them out and sharing that globally is one way that we're trying to actually do something differently. What I'm probably most excited about, and where I think research needs to find ways to interact with, is the incredible social movements that are coming out for environmental justice. I mean, we've had this since the 1970s with the Love Canal in the US, with the Chipko movement in India. But we're really seeing community organization for environmental justice growing. And partly that's because of the failure of the state to ensure that the legal rights are being upheld. But really, it's also people are saying, we want a seat at the table and we want to participate in this. And I find that really exciting. We've seen some good success stories around that, but beyond that as well, and picking up on what Michael said earlier about citizen science, this is just an example from the South Durban Community Environmental Alliance, a community that I work with in South Africa. And as you can see, it's one of these classic apartheid planning sites where you have two ancient sand dunes, and you have industry put in the middle of that, in the valley, and then you have a black working class population around it, so that easy access to a labor force, and you have the white communities up on the hills away from the pollution. We've had disastrous situations where we've had refineries where there's been burning, we have school right next to some of the petrochemical industries. What I think is really exciting is that we're also seeing citizen science at work. We're seeing communities engaging with scientists in actually doing the monitoring, in doing the alerting, in getting some of their communities through to a PhD to actually be able to come back and help with the work that's happening in those areas. And I think for me, that's where we can also think about how do we relate to communities, to civil society, with the research that we do. As you said, you know, there's a great deal of data and material and knowledge that can come, and how do we build on that? And that's not just building at a local community level, but also there's these fantastic transnational movements for environmental justice, which I see as also an opportunity to think about the agency of the people that we're talking about. Agency being the ability that they have to act, to affect change in their lives, and how important it is that we acknowledge that in the research that we do, in thinking about what is the policy and praxis applications of the work that we're doing itself. So on that note, I just want to say thank you very much for listening. I've taken a slightly different turn from what you had earlier on in the presentations, but I hope that it just put some other thoughts of why the work that we're doing isn't so important, and how do we then build bridges to actually what's happening in people's everyday lives with this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for raising these very important aspects of this complicated matter. Right? Questions? Comments?
Great.
Okay, then, yeah.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to point out that, you know, I think it's particularly acute in Africa and other places, but it's present everywhere. And Basil Shea and I published a paper some years ago, and it showed in Sweden that school children in the poorest schools were getting about twice as much nitrogen dioxide pollution. So it's this global phenomena that doesn't really respect even the most egalitarian countries in the world. And then one other point that I think you made, but I'd like to emphasize, is that the the vulnerability aspect. So the Institute of Medicine in the U.S. called it double jeopardy. So it's not just that they're exposed to more, but the people that are exposed are less able to tolerate the same dose because they have a lot of underlying health conditions and social conditions that make them more vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I think it was a great overview. I just wanted to emphasize some of those points.
Yeah, I totally support emphasizing those. I think they're really important. Unfortunately, I cannot stay for the rest of the session, but I am in Lund, so happy to chat if anyone would like to in the future.
Thank you again.